You asked for it, and after much research, like a lot of research, we finally pulled it off. I mean, what kind of cartoon addicts would we be if we didn't include The Simpsons in our Good to Evil series?
Go ahead, Maggie. You're allowed to touch the deadly weapons.
The show is a classic and a part of both childhood and adulthood, which makes sense given its well-crafted humor and goofy characters would amuse almost anyone regardless of age. I'm Kyle with Wicked Binge, and this is The Simpsons Good to Evil. Now, as you can imagine by how long The Simpsons has been running, as well as the runtime of this video, there are a lot of characters, and they won't fit in one chart. It just ain't happening. So for the first time, we've broken the characters down into 3 categories: the good, the gray area, and bad to evil. And as usual, we're starting with the most good.
He's killing me!
Of all the characters in Springfield to give the gold medal of goodness to, we're going with Ralph Wiggum. Sweet, innocent, and likely mentally challenged Ralph Wiggum.
They taste like burning.
A kid who has trouble grasping how normal social interactions work, he often gets confused, is short of what to say, or says something that unintentionally offends his peers. But Ralph doesn't have a mean bone in his body. Overall, he's a nice kid who gets along with everyone, even though he has a habit of annoying his peers with his extremely oblivious behavior.
I found a moon rock in my nose.
Thanks to that kind of behavior, Ralph is a perfect target for bullies like Nelson, and he does frequently get picked on when he crosses bullies' paths. But even when he's getting beat up or insulted, his view of the world remains positive, almost as if he's totally oblivious to the world around him, viewing the world through rose-colored glasses, as some would say. This naive yet positive outlook, along with his kind-hearted nature and gentle demeanor, earns him the highest rank on our good list. In many ways, Ralph is just too pure for this cruel world.
Help! She's touching my special area.
The silver medal of good, unsurprisingly, goes to Ned Flanders. Ned is portrayed as an extremely religious man who's keen on making the world a better place. He's honest, hardworking, forgiving, and a true family man. Yes, his extreme religious behavior can be annoying to some, but he's quickly forgiven by his neighbors due to his pure and well-meaning nature and gentle personality.
If I could give you my heart, Homer, I would.
Ned is extremely devoted to his family and is actively involved in the upbringing of his 2 boys, Rod and Todd. After his beloved wife, Maude, dies thanks to Homer's carelessness, he decides to keep himself composed for his 2 sons, and does an amazing job at being a single father. He even forgives Homer for what he did, accepting the incident as an accident that Homer had no control over, which takes extreme mental stability and strength. Ned is also no stranger to helping those in need. He's often seen volunteering and will always help those around him, even Homer, who constantly treats him poorly. Truly, Ned is the epitome of how a religious man is supposed to be: kind, compassionate, and without an evil bone in his entire body. Thus, we grace him with the title of second most good character in The Simpsons. The only reason we chose to rank him as second is that his own views make him a bit narrow-minded at times.
Son of a diddly.
But his intentions are always pure. Ned Flanders is a person who's always there for a family member, a friend, or even a neighbor who doesn't treat him with the same respect. On the topic of Flanders, Rod and Todd are apples that don't fall far from Ned's Tree of Eden. As clueless as they are, these 2 brothers are every bit as pure as their father, usually to a fault.
How about a sitting still contest?
And while we're at it, let's throw in their mother, Maude, as well. Like her husband, Ned, Maude did everything she could to live life as a moral person. Certainly uptight, but the whole Flanders family lived their lives with genuinely pure and righteous intent.
No footlongs.
I know, they make you uncomfortable.
Now we have Lisa Simpson. Lisa is an innovative, caring, and extremely intelligent girl who by far exceeds the standards of a regular 3rd grader. Even though her high intelligence is beyond obvious, her family never encouraged her gift, and her school simply did not have the resources to keep up with her high IQ.
This looks very educational.
Even though she was short of support, she still grew up into a clever and kind girl. She stays up to date on news and politics, has vast knowledge of history and art, has an incredible talent for music, and is involved with many activist groups. All in all, despite being brought up in a household with parents that are irresponsible and unable to nurture her gifts, she remains smart and caring.
Here, little fella.
Dad, no!
That said, one could argue that she's a bit narcissistic. If her ego is at risk, she will resort to cheap tactics such as sabotage and cheating. For example, when her rival Allison had a chance to win a prize at the school fair, she sabotaged her and thus humiliated her in front of her peers. But that is out of her usual character, and she typically learns from these mistakes. Lisa is a loving, compassionate child who's well in tune with her emotions, all despite the fact that nobody around her truly understands her.
Don't worry, Bart. They won't bother you anymore.
We're gonna throw in Maggie Simpson here as well. Although she's a baby, her strength was evident when she picked up a mallet and hit her own father with it, a behavior she saw on Itchy and Scratchy, a kids' TV show that shows rather extreme forms of violence. But we can't hold that against her since she's just an impressionable baby.
Daddy.
And on the topic of good children, let's talk about Martin. Always the butt of a joke, there's no denying that Martin is a good kid.
Very well. You have made your point.
And although he's brilliant, his biggest weakness is how naive he is. With that said, he is a bit snobbish, and on very rare occasions, Martin himself became a bully when given the rare opportunity. As we move on down our list, we get to our next member of the Simpson family, Marge Simpson. Marge is a kind-hearted mother and the head of the Simpsons household. She loves her family deeply and is very protective of them. Due to Homer's incompetence, she takes care of the household chores and organizes the family's finances.
Look, Maggie, I'm Wonder Woman.
Despite this, Marge can be overly protective, strict, and at times very naive. Even though she is generally calm, she can have major outbursts of anger if she's disrespected. Although Marge is portrayed as a sweet person, she is also a massive hypocrite, which we see on multiple occasions. For example, she secretly kept Homer's handgun for herself after disapproving of his use of it.
Homer, I don't want guns in my house.
And she used violent methods in order to protest against the violent Grand Theft Scratchy video game, which was beyond ironic. That said, Marge is without a doubt the good parent in the house, and her commitment to her family, despite Homer's negligence, is worthy of a lot of praise. Up next is Waylon Smithers, Mr. Burns' assistant. Despite being the assistant of such a vile, evil person, Smithers is actually a pretty decent guy.
Oh, Smithers, do you always have to be underfoot?
He often shows a strong moral backbone. For instance, when Mr. Burns tries to block Springfield from the sun, he stands up against him, which resulted in him being fired. He was also accused of shooting Mr. Burns, but was quickly let go when it became obvious that he couldn't hurt a fly.
Okay, Smithers, you're free to go.
That said, we're docking him a little bit for the simple fact that he's in love with someone as morally reprehensible as Mr. Burns. But with that said, Smithers has been shown to be a good, yet reserved person. Moving on to Apu. The owner of his own shop, Apu is generally a nice person to be around. He's nice to his customers, determined when it comes to his business, and a good friend of Homer. He's also a family man, and likely the hardest working person in Springfield. Despite having such a stressful work schedule, Apu usually does everything with a smile on his face. However, he too has his own negative traits. From time to time, we see him resort to manipulation tactics to make his customers buy more of his products, and his strict work ethic can make him yell at his employees. For example, in the episode Marge in Chains, he ruthlessly prosecutes Marge over a misplaced bottle of bourbon. We also see that he has problems with infidelity.
Oh, Apu, you keep scoring while my back is turned.
With that said, when you weigh Apu's good and bad behaviors, you'll find an overall good person. Maybe it's easy to slip up when you work the long, stressful hours that Apu works. Next up is Dr. Hibbert. He's a friendly doctor whose memorable laughter seems to put a smile on everyone's face.
He won't be able to talk for quite some time.
Dr. Hibbert is definitely one of the more grounded characters in Springfield and seems to have his head screwed on right. With that said, he did tell Marge that if she ever needed painkillers, there would be no questions asked. That's gotta be considered some form of malpractice. Next up is Bart Simpson, Springfield Elementary's most famous prankster. Bart is often shown to be up to no good. He's always in trouble, whether that be in school or in his own family house.
Ay, caramba.
His love for pranks goes back to his early childhood, and he's often seen scheming his next prank as opposed to learning or engaging in some other constructive activity, always to the dismay of his mother. Bart's pranks can range from totally harmless to beyond cruel and destructive, depending on his mood and given situation. He doesn't have a good relationship with the school system, and he's always getting in trouble with teachers, especially Miss Krabappel. Bart is prone to highly delinquent behavior, and Lisa even noted once that his behavior was borderline sociopathic. But to be honest, that seems like an awful stretch. Because even though he's a troublemaker, Bart's actually a pretty good kid at heart.
I don't want to hurt real people. Oh, I want to go home.
He's caring and compassionate, and has proved this on multiple occasions. He protected Lisa against her bullies multiple times, stood by Milhouse's side when Nelson was tormenting him, and even went out of his way to reunite his idol Krusty the Clown with his father. One time, he even helped Principal Skinner, who he has constant conflicts with, in order to help him with his relationship with Edna Krabappel. Lenny and Carl are up next. Although they're portrayed as blue-collar guys, they both have masters in nuclear physics.
Oh yeah, Carl and I each have a master's.
Always together, Lenny and Carl are probably best noted as good-natured guys who remain loyal to their pal Homer. For example, when Frank Grimes had it out for Homer, Lenny and Carl routinely stuck up for him with their usual good nature.
Yeah, Homer's okay. Give him a break.
Next up is Milhouse, the school's most picked-on nerd and Bart's partner in crime. Milhouse, being physically weak and nerdy, is a constant target for bullies such as Jimbo and Nelson.
Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself.
Despite being bullied, Milhouse is still a compassionate person who aims to please everyone, even if it causes damage to himself. His best friend is Bart Simpson, who he cares for deeply and assists in various schemes. In many episodes, he's seen by Bart's side when everyone else turns against him, which proves that he's generally a loyal and protective friend. Milhouse also has a crush on Lisa and will do anything to get her attention. Lisa's feelings are not mutual, but that doesn't stop him from continuously expressing his love for her and trying to win her heart. Milhouse is an overall good, yet cowardly and unlucky kid.
I can't be a baby anymore.
But there was that one time that he got Bart to sell him his soul before trying to sell it back to him at a way higher cost. That's actually really messed up, especially how much joy it seemed to bring him to have leverage over his friend. Homer's half-brother, Herb Simpson, is worth a quick mention. Intelligent, ambitious, and passionate, nothing like Homer. Although he does get incredibly angry with his brother. But the reason that we gave Herb a good ranking, mainly, is because after Homer's car design ruined his company, he forgave him and was still happy to call Homer his brother.
I forgive you. You can call me brother, and I can do the same.
A small character, yes, but he has a big personality. I'm talking about Disco Stew. To be honest, I can't really come up with a whole lot of examples for Disco Stew's good deeds, but how do you not love this guy's positive, funky personality? He's always in a good mood, and it seems to be contagious.
Disco Stew likes disco music.
Then again, I suppose he can be a bit creepy at times when hitting on Marge. Edna Krabappel is next. Edna is defined by her cynicism and short temper, making her the most disliked teacher among the students, especially Bart, who takes every chance to mess with her.
It might be nice to talk to a grown-up for a change.
Regarding her teaching methods, Edna is often unbothered by her students' well-being, but at times, she can take stern disciplinary measures. An example of this would be when the new yo-yo trend overran her classroom, and in response, she confiscated every single toy she found. Although she usually doesn't resort to physical punishment as a disciplinary measure, she does have angry outbursts when her temper is pushed too far. Despite her cold exterior, Edna is actually a deeply sad and lonely woman who's in desperate need of someone to spend time with and talk to. One time she actually tried to bargain with her students to stay behind by saying she'll do their homework for them, just so she'd have some company after work hours. We see how desperate Edna is for personal connection in many of her relationships, all of which never seem to work out. Poor Miss Krabappel. Now we have Principal Skinner, the principal of Springfield Elementary. He's shown to be quite a strict and stern principal, but at times he also shows great signs of incompetence when it comes to his job and his students' behavior. Although he presents himself to be confident and a strong leader, he's full of insecurities issues and is often nervous and fidgety when he's supposed to make big decisions. Skinner, although seeming tough and strict, is actually quite tame and spineless in his private life.
Mother doesn't approve of me dating.
He has a very unusually close relationship with his toxic mother and practically lets her control his life even though he's in his late 40s. But Skinner also has an intense side. In multiple episodes, he shows that he has a strong moral backbone and isn't afraid to stand up for what he believes in. For example, he once stood up against his mother's wishes and proposed to Edna Krabappel, and he also stood up against his boss multiple times, even though he was risking his job by doing so.
Here's something I've wanted to say to you for a long time.
Also, it's important to say that Skinner's so-called square personality, as defined by his students, isn't just a result of his mother's upbringing, but also his traumatic experiences as a Green Beret in the Vietnam War. It's believed that the negative experience he had while at war scarred him deeply and left him with PTSD, which greatly influences his personality. Rounding out the tail end of our good characters, we have Abe Simpson, Homer's father. Grandpa Simpson is the core definition of a grumpy old man.
Who are you? What do you want? What year is it? Who are you?
He's cynical, a downer, and has an extremely negative view of the world, especially the youth. His negative attitude is mostly a result caused by his poor living conditions. He lives in Springfield's retirement home, which has no entertaining activities and is full of elderly people who are just as negative as him. But we can't really blame him for his negative mood. After all, his own family doesn't visit him.
But they're coming! My son even put a note on his refrigerator!
That said, Abe's lousy parenting skills as a father definitely lose him some good points. Although, like Principal Skinner, Abe is also a war veteran and someone who seems to have once lived a life of great integrity and courage. And with Grandpa Simpson out of the way, that wraps up our overall good characters. We now move on to what we call the gray area. Now, what can you say about Otto? In many ways, he's a fun, goofy guy who loves heavy metal, drugs, and having fun.
I bet you could throw a dead body in there and no one would ever find it.
He's pleasant, friendly, and seems like a good-natured guy, but we can't really overlook the gross negligence when it comes to his job as school bus driver. He is incredibly reckless, with no regard for the children, and is even known to smoke pot while driving them around, and possibly doing harder drugs as well.
Ooh, but I'll never pass with this. I better switch samples.
Surprisingly, Barney was a pretty decent guy before he started drinking, but after having his first bottle of beer at Homer's persuasion, his life quickly went downhill.
Alright, just one. If it'll get you off my back.
He quit school and became a hardcore alcoholic whose only pleasure is spending time in Moe's Tavern. Now, we know he sounds like an ordinary drunk, and we don't deny that he is, but we gotta hand it to him. Despite having such a miserable life,
If you didn't close, I'd never leave.
he still remains friendly and good-natured to people around him. The main problem is that his good-natured personality is usually tainted by alcohol, or worse, the lack of it.
I have a problem with alcohol and I need help.
Sometimes, when forced to quit drinking and go to rehab, Barney turns extremely violent and deranged. One time, after Mr. Burns decided to close Moe's Tavern, Barney bought a gun and intended to shoot and kill Mr. Burns. There's definitely some darkness in there, but I think more than anything, Barney is a tragic figure. Next, we finally have the series' main character, Homer Simpson. Homer is depicted as, well, a total moron who goes back and forth from a loving, caring father to a downright horrible person. Homer's entire personality revolves around him being immature, selfish, lazy, and at times, extremely violent.
Isn't anybody gonna follow in my footsteps?
He's prone to violent bursts of anger when things don't go his way, and his anger is typically targeted at his son, Bart, who he often chokes. Now, it's kind of hard to make this out to be totally abusive because the choking is essentially a recurring visual gag that is meant to be seen as more harmless in the context of the show. But it definitely takes some good points away from him. Homer also has a very fragile ego. For example, he was extremely upset about Marge pursuing a career in the police force because it took his position as the man of the house.
I have nothing more to say to you, Marge.
If we dive deeper into his character, we'll also see that Homer possesses some truly sadistic characteristics, such as getting amusement from others' misfortune. And we're not talking about just pranks or harmless silly situations. His lack of empathy for others goes as extreme as being amused by horrible car crashes he saw in a documentary about alcoholism. And let's not skip over his terrible treatments of good old Ned Flanders. Still, we can't ignore Homer's good side. At times, he is actually a great father, and there's no denying that he truly cares about his family. One time, he sold his cherished ride on the Duff blimp just so he could afford to enter Lisa into a beauty pageant in hopes to make her feel better about herself. And of course, the famous Do It For Her episode in which he gives up his dream job to work for Mr. Burns. Honestly, the list of his good deeds goes on, but they don't erase his regular terrible behavior. Up next is Troy McClure. You may remember him from such films as McBain 4, Fatal Discharge, and The Revenge of Abe Lincoln. Aside from his declining career, not much is known about Troy's backstory, but he did admit to agreeing to marry Selma simply to help his career. He's a bit hard to rank, but next up we're throwing in old Gil Gunderson, the unluckiest salesman in Springfield.
No, wait, no, you can't take my sale. My wife's gonna leave me.
Given Gil's whole character is based around bad stuff happening to him, he doesn't really have a whole lot of opportunity to showcase any inherently good or evil traits. So we're gonna go ahead and put him here because, well, we kind of feel bad for him. Now we have Nelson, Springfield Elementary's most notorious bully. It might be surprising why he isn't in the bad or evil categories. Nelson is portrayed as a classic bully who dominates the schoolyard. He's mean and tough, and uses his rough demeanor to persuade kids weaker than him to do his bidding. His favorite targets include Milhouse and Bart, who he regularly picks on. Being from a poverty-stricken family, his violent and delinquent behavior may be a protective mechanism he uses to suppress his emotions regarding his financial situation.
He didn't leave. He went to the store.
Along with his unfortunate economic situation, Nelson's parents are often cold and distant, and his rebellious behavior may be a tactic to get their attention.
My mom ditched me. She went to Hollywood to be an actress.
Nelson's behavior is also likely a result of his low self-esteem and lack of true positive relationships in life. He's often surrounded by friends who only seem to hang out with him when they need a certain favor. Nelson is actually quite desperate when it comes to friendship. He longs for relationships his peers have and admires the brotherly love Bart and Milhouse share, but don't know how to form said friendships himself or chooses rather aggressive tactics to get the neighborhood kids to like him. For example, when his birthday was near, he sent menacing invitations to his peers which said, "Come to my party or die," which of course made the kids boycott his birthday altogether.
They're coming! They are!
Regarding his love life, Nelson is quite fond of Lisa, and the two were seen briefly dating, but quickly broke up because Nelson couldn't resist not being involved in delinquent activities. He states multiple times that he loved Lisa and that she broke his heart. He even has a fake tattoo of her name and gets extremely jealous whenever she talks to other boys. Overall, Nelson is a misunderstood kid with serious emotional issues who does strive to be a better person at times, but often fails because, after all, he's a troubled kid. Although it doesn't excuse his actions, he doesn't grasp the severity of his own emotional trauma.
I touched your heart!
A minor character, but an important one, Mona Simpson is next. In many ways, she is a sympathetic character.
Don't worry, Homer. You'll always be a part of me.
Having had to deal with Abe Simpson as a husband, but her criminal history aside, it's difficult to see her as a good person when she abandoned Homer as a child, which clearly led to so many of his problems as an adult. She is apologetic, and her initial episode is a tearjerker, but her morality is pretty lacking to say the least. On to our next character, Super Nintendo Chalmers, a total hothead who gives Principal Skinner anxiety in just about every situation. We like to think that he isn't necessarily the worst person out there, he just appears to be a tough boss.
Skinner? Superintendent Chalmers.
That said, he does harbor some pretty awful grudges that really show his true colors. At one point, he let Flanders ruin the school as principal just because he hates Principal Skinner. I would hate to have him as my boss. And rounding out our neutral characters with someone else who works for the school, we have groundskeeper Willie. And truth be told, Willie shifts back and forth between an angry enemy and an invaluable ally.
There's nary an animal alive that can outrun a greased Scotsman.
But there is no denying that Willie has an incredible anger problem. He's also always drunk on the job and always irritable. It's also implied that he's accidentally killed children before. When he shreds a ball on his tractor, he screams in horror that he ran over a child again. But I suppose at least he shows some remorse. And with old Willie out of the way, we now enter the immoral side of the spectrum. These characters are the bad and the evil. First, we have the bully trio, Kearney, and then Jimbo and Dolph. We're gonna lump these three characters together because they're always grouped together in the show. Like Nelson, we chose to give them a little leeway given the fact that they are younger and also from troubled homes. But they are significantly older. A running gag on the show is that they've been held back over and over. They're bullies to children who are notably younger than them, they vandalize and steal, and are all around immoral. But they do exhibit some positive behavior. Kearney, for example, seems to love his son and even has a comedically high level of involvement in the community, attending PTA meetings for his son and being a part of the church council, which is why if we picked one to be slightly more decent, it would be him.
Fixing this church should be our top priority.
Moving on to Comic Book Guy, although he isn't a criminal and he hasn't done anything morally reprehensible,
You what now?
he does have an absolutely terrible personality, and more importantly, he doesn't really exhibit any sort of positive behavior. Comic Book Guy is condescending, rude, and talks down to everyone, and he even treats his customers cruelly.
Don't you latte-sipping leeches understand?
In fact, he's known to extort his patrons out of expensive collectibles and rip people off. He's just an incredibly negative and downright toxic person. Next is Helen Lovejoy, wife of Reverend Lovejoy, who we'll talk about in a minute. Simply put, she is puritanical and someone who pushes her ways on all those around her. Additionally, she's the town gossip.
I think they enjoy being humiliated.
Really not someone you should trust, given her big mouth and judgmental personality. Up next comes Krusty the Clown. When he was young, he displayed similar traits as Homer, such as laziness, selfishness, and a never-ending need to be the center of attention. Due to his desperate need to be in the entertainment industry, Krusty enrolled in clown school and soon got major contracts for TV shows and merchandise.
A Jewish entertainer? Get out of here.
On stage, he's fun and loud, but offstage, he's a whole other person. He's a manic depressive alcoholic gambler with absolutely no appreciation for his fans. Speaking of his fans, not only does he not appreciate them, but he openly discusses how he dislikes them and how meeting and performing for them is a chore. During his meet and greets, he almost never gives autographs and couldn't care less if the children spent hours to get to his show, often employing his assistants to do his work for him. One time he even left his show and kept hundreds of kids waiting just so he could buy a lottery ticket. What a guy. Now let's not forget Kent Brockman. Truthfully, we rank Brockman this low not because of his poor skills at reading the news,
Dear God, this can't be happening.
but because he was exposed to have lied about his serving in Iraq under the 98th Airborne Squadron.
Spare me your slang, pusher man. You're fired.
He has proven several times to have very low ethical standards. It's sad to see law enforcement so deep into the evil list, but Chief Wiggum is next. He is a walking bad policeman stereotype. Lazy, corrupt, and ignorant. His badge literally says cash bribes only. Wiggum routinely displays ignorance to the law, usually making up obscene reasons for arresting people or just simply ignoring his responsibilities altogether.
Plant the evidence on him, boys.
One of the dominant tactics he uses to get out of his policeman responsibilities is to simply tell the caller they've got the wrong number, which is beyond irresponsible. Despite all this, there have been some instances where Wiggum proves to be a good cop. For example, one time he successfully located Maggie when she suddenly went missing. Occasionally, he shows real dedication to his work, but his ignorance and corrupt behavior still outshines his good actions immeasurably. Although his own ignorance isn't a justification for corruption and disregarding the laws that he was sworn to enforce, we will admit that Wiggum does seem to want to do the right thing oftentimes, and may actually be so dumb that he doesn't understand that everything he does is wrong. So he's certainly immoral, but not evil, just really, really stupid. Moving on to Lionel Hutz, Springfield's most well-known bad lawyer.
Ooh, he's gonna win.
Aside from his obvious incompetence in his profession, Lionel is known to be greedy, dishonorable, and a liar. He claims to be a graduate of Princeton Law School, despite the fact that Princeton hasn't had a law school since the mid-19th century. Hutz has also been guilty of forgery and fraud, among other felonies.
You'd be surprised how often that works. You really would.
But you really can't expect much better from someone whose legal practice is named I Can't Believe It's a Law Firm. But someone even more awful is Agnes Skinner. Possibly the perfect example of an awful, psychologically abusive and controlling mother.
I'm sick of this house and I'm sick of you.
She has an awful attitude that seems to teeter on some sort of anti-personality disorder and controls her adult son in a terrible and emasculating manner. It's no wonder that her son has problems. Moving on to Reverend Lovejoy, he was once, supposedly, a very passionate man who was committed deeply to his religious beliefs.
Oh, I don't see you volunteering to make things better.
But since then has turned into an apathetic and disinterested reverend. He is incredibly passive-aggressive, and his religious beliefs are certainly a bit draconian, as he's led mass burnings and has taken part in mob riots. Heck, he's even attempted to persecute children and crucify people. When Lisa converted to Buddhism, he referred to her as Marge Simpson's devil daughter.
Well, next on our agenda, Marge Simpson's devil daughter.
In some episodes, it's strongly suggested that he's stealing money that is donated to the church, and he even partakes in a gambling scheme in the episode Sky Police. As far as goodness goes, well, he really doesn't offer much. When someone asks him for guidance, he just sorta passes the buck and tells them to read the Bible. On top of that, he appears to be a negligent parent, sending his daughter Jessica off to boarding school so he doesn't have to deal with her. Next on our list, we have Selma and Patty, Marge's sisters. Selma and Patty are most known for their cynical and sarcastic personalities and their mutual dislike of Homer, as they believe he isn't good enough for Marge. Although we do agree that Homer definitely doesn't put enough energy into his marriage with Marge as she does with him, Selma and Patty's negative attitude towards Homer is often too drastic and downright heartless. For example, when Marge rushed to the hospital upon hearing Homer had a heart attack, Selma and Patty couldn't care less and remained seated at their table, continuing cutting coupons and chatting as though nothing went wrong. When Homer faked his death to get out of work, Patty and Selma showed up at the Simpsons' home holding a tombstone which said, "Homer J. Simpson, we are richer having lost him." I mean, that is really screwed up. Their insensitive attitude towards the situation causes Marge to kick them out, but the two remained unfazed. Even after being continuously told that their actions hurt Marge's feelings, they continue their pursuit of finding Marge a decent man, a goal they always fail at.
Marge, this is Andre.
Hello.
Selma and Patty exhibit some textbook examples of anti-personality disorder. Next up, we have Moe Sislak, the owner of Moe's Tavern and one of Homer's closest friends. Moe is characterized by his short temper, violent outbursts, and his nasty attitude towards everyone.
I don't deserve this kind of shabby treatment.
He has both suicidal and homicidal tendencies and isn't afraid to get involved in criminal activities. He was a part of multiple angry mobs, has participated in the kidnapping of Talking Heads vocalist David Byrne, and has shot multiple people on multiple occasions without a justified reason.
All right. Tell me when I hit the sweet spot.
He also indulged in some rather bizarre behavior, such as stalking Marge Simpson, who he is desperately in love with. He harassed and stalked Maud Flanders as well, which resulted in him being registered as a sex offender. Overall, Moe does show an occasional good side, but his frequent run-ins with the law, obsessive and perverse behavior, selfishness, and violent tendencies will always outshine his gentler side. But at the end of the day, the person that Moe hurts the most is himself. Although he only appeared in one episode, we had to include Frank Grimes.
Okay, Grimy.
Although I suppose you could argue he's a sympathetic character, Grimes, or Grimy as Homer calls him, is an incredibly negative, bitter person who personifies jealousy to such an unhealthy level that it actually kills him.
Because I'm Homer Simpson.
Someone like Moe is pretty wildly flawed, but he's so depressed and self-loathing that you can't help but feel bad for him. Grimy is hateful, bitter, and looks down at the person who he's jealous of.
And what do you have to show for your lifetime of sloth and ignorance?
He's also incapable of controlling his emotions and spiteful to the point in which we don't even feel sorry for him when he dies. Heck, everyone at the funeral breaks out in laughter.
I'm the worst worker in the world. Time to go home to my mansion and eat my lobster.
Probably the most upfront about his immorality is Snake Jailbird. Snake's whole identity is based around his criminal behavior, from stealing cars to robbery to toting around illegal guns. He's stolen cars from at least a dozen characters that we know about. We really can't forget about arguably the biggest con man in Springfield, Nick Rivera, who went to Hollywood Upstairs Medical College, where he sold prescription drugs to meet women.
Seriously, baby, I can prescribe anything I want.
Not a good start. This medical quack is a shady, immoral doctor who performs medical procedures with no regard for medical ethics or his patients' well-being.
These gloves came free with my toilet brush.
Heck, this guy was once seen digging up corpses for body parts, presumably for operations with living patients. Which, I mean, come on, is a level of medical malpractice that has to fall into the evil category, right? Okay, maybe there is a bigger con man in Springfield, one who happens to be the mayor, Mayor Quimby. Really the pinnacle of corruption. He's an opportunistic politician who will do anything to keep himself in power. He doesn't care about the city, oftentimes spending so much time on vacation that the headline, Mayor Visits City, is printed. Not to mention he once called Springfield Sprungfield. He regularly takes bribes from criminals including Fat Tony and is also known to be a tax cheat. He's stolen tax money and city-funded material for personal gain and is also known to be unfaithful to his wife. Time and time again, Quimby is shown willing to sell out his city for personal gain.
Good lord, I'm an abomination.
Next on our list comes Fat Tony. Fat Tony is portrayed as the ominous leader of the Springfield mob, who routinely participate in illegal activities such as kidnapping, fraud, selling fake IDs, illegal gambling, shootings, murder, etc. Illegal activities aren't a problem for Fat Tony if he's going to accumulate money that way. He actually grew up very poor and fled his home as a young adult, and ended up sleeping in abandoned buildings, supermarkets, and on the streets. After getting to know the underground world, he quickly rose to the top and managed to become one of the most feared mob bosses on Springfield's territory, often whacking his enemies before they even got the chance to reach him.
Take him out.
Fat Tony is also portrayed as a family man. He's a single father and is actively taking care of his son, and he seems to be doing his fatherly role well, from what we've seen, but we can't overlook the fact that Fat Tony is responsible for all sorts of crime throughout Springfield, including murders, which usually end with his goons disposing of bodies. Now, the silver medal of evil goes to Mr. Burns, the series' main antagonist. You probably would think that we'd crown him the most evil character of today's episode, but trust us, we have someone far more heinous in mind. Montgomery Burns grew up in a loving family with several siblings, and was practically well-behaved and kind. But after he left his family to live with his grandfather, a twisted and heartless billionaire, his character took a turn for the worse. During his time living with his grandfather, Mr. Burns lived a life of privilege and would amuse himself by injuring hapless immigrant laborers. His grandfather saw nothing wrong with his grandson's actions, and thus did nothing to correct his behavior.
I said break a leg.
As he grew, Mr. Burns had no real parental figure to lead him through his life. Thus, his cold-hearted and selfish personality is a result of his grandfather's carelessness and horrible way of parenting. Mr. Burns' extremely selfish attitude only grew more as he matured, and by the time he was a fully grown adult, he embodied every single stereotype about corporate America, with greed being the most prominent trait.
Smithers? My wallet's in my right front pocket.
He also has absolutely no empathy towards others. When annoyed by those who request charity, he often releases his dogs, the hounds, on them with absolutely no remorse. He has no problem destroying the environment, putting his employees in danger, firing people who don't deserve it, and yes, even blocking the sun.
That's ridiculous. The last tree held 9 drums.
But, finally, the gold medal of evil goes to the series' most feared antagonist, Sideshow Bob. Voiced by Kelsey Grammer, he got his stage name when he was Krusty the Clown's sidekick, a job position which he hated with a passion. During showtime, he would often be mistreated and even psychologically hurt by Krusty. Fed up with Krusty's abuse, Bob disguised himself as Krusty and framed him for armed robbery at the Quickie Mart. After Krusty's arrest, Bob became the center part of their show, which he then used to educate children on elements of high culture. His happiness was short-lived though. Bart, shocked by the downfall of his hero, decided to expose the true reason Krusty was behind bars. Soon after, Bob's treachery was uncovered by Bart and Lisa, and he was sent to prison. On his way to his sentence, Bob swore to get revenge on Bart, and during his time in prison developed an extreme hate and obsession for him and his family. During his time in prison, he expressed some deeply disturbing behavior. He tattooed gruesome tattoos of Bart being decapitated on his back and the saying, "Die Bart die," on his chest. He also sent countless threatening letters to Bart, written in his own blood. Soon after he escaped prison, he planned to make his demented fantasies come true, which ranged from kidnapping, hurting, and even murdering Bart and his family. It wasn't long before people Bart found dear went missing or severely hurt. Bart's family was kidnapped on multiple occasions and almost killed by various explosives, and his Aunt Selma was almost brutally murdered in a hotel room. After dozens of threats to both Bart directly and his loved ones, Bob decided to take things to the next level and face Bart directly. Fortunately, his countless attempts to end Bart's life were stopped, and he was sent to prison with no chance of parole. But fortunately for him, he was released for a short time to solve a mystery regarding the attempted murder of Homer Simpson's life.
How can one ordinary man have so many enemies?
His investigation was successful, and he did not return to prison, but instead moved to Italy to settle down. There, he met Francesca, who he soon married and had a son with. It would have been amazing if his life truly did get better there, but no. After his wife learned about his awful past, she promises to aid her husband when he attempts to kill Bart again, and the cycle continues.
Vendetta! Vendetta for me, Papa!
So, is he truly deserving of a happy ending? We personally think no. But what do you think? With so many characters in The Simpsons, it's hard to pick one who is the most evil, or good for that matter. Make sure to binge watch our full Good to Evil playlist, where we break down the morality of the characters in your favorite shows, cartoons, and movies. But most importantly, stay wicked.